Okay, all right. We are going to do a post-debate wrap-up on off the cuff, we should say, with
This
Jimmy
was
Akin.
unplanned. I just got a text from Matt saying, "Do you want to go live again and talk about it and take questions?" I was like, "Yeah, why not?"
Fantastic. Oh my gosh, that was amazing. That was a lot of fun. I said to you off air that I still don't know how I feel. Right? I think I feel like
Uh-huh.
a lot of Christians feel. It's like any argument in my arsenal for God's existence is a welcome one, unless it can be shown to me that it really doesn't work. And in that case, it might just make your side look silly, and so I don't
hmm
want to have to do that.
And that's really my goal in doing this because, like I said, I like the Kalam argument. I think it's great. It is simple. It is easy to present to people. I just want to make sure that the versions of it that we're using are actually successful. Because if you're talking to us, let's say a smart atheist or a smart agnostic, and they point out, oh wait, you can form a an actual infinity by successive addition if you're doing it from without presupposing a beginning to that series. I mean, that's a sharp atheist, a sharp agnostic, a sharp thinker of any perspective could point that out. And if you're not prepared to counter that or acknowledge that, if you've been using a version of the argument that presupposes that, forewarned is forearmed. So I think it's
Hmm.
important for us as Christians and as apologists to test our arguments and make sure they really do work, that they're not just convenient, kind of glib, persuasive things to say.
My immediate reaction to the one
Mhm.
hour discussion we just had was, and again, I still don't know who I agree with here. I really have to think a
Mhm.
lot more about it, right? But it's that the Kalam argument is something you could share on an elevator ride.
Mhm.
Responding to that takes a lot more time to try and show why it might not be right. You know what I'm saying? So it
Oh
feels like
yeah.
that could have been a 3 hour discussion, and we would have just been scratching the surface.
Yeah, there's a phenomenon in there ought to be a name for it in epistemology, like um, doxastic entropy or something like that, or it always takes more time to respond to something than to state a claim. And or if someone makes their case, it always takes more time to respond than it does to state the case. And it's the same. There is a physical principle and even a saying for it where we say, okay, it takes longer to clean up milk than to spill it. And it's the same thing with information entropy, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think you can state again, because there's people in the live chat who are like, can he please give us the cliff notes, break it down for us? If you were to sort of try to sum this up and give your position in as simply as possible, what would you say?
So I would say, well, let me give it one way and then you tell me if you want more detail.
Sure.
So I would say that the Kalam cosmological argument that if anything has a beginning, it has a cause, the universe has a cause, therefore the universe has a beginning. I think that is a valid argument, and I think it's a
I think
sound
you
argument.
got that the wrong way around there. You said everything that begins to exist has a cause, and then you said the universe has a beginning. Or you said the universe has a
Yeah.
cause, but you meant the
Oh,
universe
I'm
has a
sorry.
beginning.
Well,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just for
therefore
those
the
at home.
universe has a cause.
Right.
Sorry. But I think it's a valid argument, meaning it's correct logically. And so if its premises are true, then its conclusion is true. And I think the premises are true. Anything that has a beginning does have a cause, and the universe does have a beginning. Therefore, the universe does have a cause, which we can meaningfully call God. And so I think that is a sound argument. It's simple. It's easy to understand. It's an elevator pitch type of argument, just like you said. I think that the easiest way to show that the universe has a beginning to someone who's not already a believer, because if they're a believer, you could say, well, first verse of the Bible, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So right there is a beginning. But if you're talking to someone who's not already a believer, then you need to give them something other than just a Bible verse. And I think the easiest thing to give someone today is Big Bang cosmology, because everybody's heard of the Big Bang. They know it's a scientific conclusion. They know that it's universally accepted virtually among astronomers. So it's a highly respectable, highly credible idea. Even if you don't have time on the elevator to talk about how we know the Big Bang happened, just appealing to the fact it's right there. I think this is the best version of the Kalam argument because it is so simple to state. And then the second premise is defended by something everybody knows, the Big Bang. So that, to me, is the obvious strategy for how to present it. The philosophical arguments for why the universe had a beginning are always going to be more complex and abstruse, and you're not going to have time on the elevator to make them part of your elevator pitch. So already there's a tactical disadvantage to the philosophical approach. But then I think actually, in fact, with Aquinas, that the philosophical arguments that have been proposed, both in his day and in ours, I don't think those actually work. I think they contain flaws that an intelligent person, regardless of their religious perspective, could point out.
Now, he seemed to correct something I said. I was of the opinion that Aquinas felt strongly that the Kalam argument didn't work, and he said that maybe Aquinas said different things throughout his life regarding it. Do you know anything about that?
Well, there is a passage in Aquinas where he's talking about the arguments that have been proposed for the universe having to have a beginning, and he says these don't prove it, but he thinks they do have some evidentiary value.
Oh, okay.
And so he's not saying there's no value here, but they're not conclusive.
Now, something he brought up multiple times was that you were coming at this from a theological perspective. I want to give you a chance to respond to that, but suppose you were, and that could be critiqued. Why not just begin with the assumption that, begin with the premise, we don't know whether or not there's a cause to the universe. Let's start to think about it. If you were to do that without sort of bringing in this other theological knowledge that he kept saying you were doing, would his argument hold more weight then?
Well, I don't think it ultimately would, because it would ultimately have to collide with theological knowledge. It's like saying if suppose I'm going to forget the fact that atoms exist, and I'm going to try to do science without that. Oh yeah, that'll open up some possibilities for what we could imagine scientifically if atoms don't exist. But eventually, we're going to crash into the fact that atoms do exist, and that's just going to limit the scientific claims we can make.
Fair enough. And so, as simply as you can, what is it that you're bringing in theologically wise to the discussion that he accused you of doing?
Well, I'm sort of bringing in the key thing, and I would actually dispute that these are theological claims, because there are people who have arrived at them through purely philosophical considerations. One of them, there were basically two. One of them is the understanding of God's omnipotence as being able to do anything that's logically possible. And that's straight out of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, I would say that's not simply a theological matter, because if you go into the literature in Christian philosophy, there are all kinds of discussions of what does it mean to be omnipotent? Is that a logically coherent position or not? And so it's not simply a theological thing. Actually, if you look, in fact, I would say this actually is a purely, I should say it this way. If you go into the Bible, there is no verse that says God's power means, his omnipotence means that he can do anything logically possible. That's something the philosophers came up with as a way of understanding the biblical data. Similarly, if you go into the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it's not going to say God's omnipotence means he can do anything logically possible. That's not a matter of church teaching. So it's neither a matter of biblical data or a matter of church teaching. It is a philosophical matter that's part of philosophical theology. The second thing that I brought in, and this is something I did because it's Pints with Aquinas. It's a Catholic channel. It's got lots of Catholic listeners. I felt the need to say, hey, just to let folks know, not every version of this argument and not all the claims made in connection with it are consistent with Catholic teachings. In particular, the idea that God is inside of time or temporal, at least since he created time, is not in accord with Catholic teaching. Catholics need to be aware of that. I see frequently, not just on this subject, but on other subjects, I see Catholics looking for literature that will help them build their faith, and they will find something from a non-Catholic source and think, oh, this is great. I'm going to use these as my arguments, maybe against Jehovah's Witnesses. Let's say they'll find a Protestant book on Jehovah's Witnesses, and they'll think these are great arguments to use against the Jehovah's Witnesses. And what they don't realize is actually some of those arguments violate Catholic teaching. You have to use critical thinking when you're reading non-Catholic or Catholic material, and do a sifting between what's consistent and what's not. And I see the same thing with Catholic apologists on this subject. They will say, read a book by Bill Craig, which has a lot of great stuff in it, and they'll think, oh, this is all great. I can take all of this and just use it without reflecting on, wait, does this actually comport with Catholic teaching or not? And so that was the second thing, the fact that God is outside of time on Catholic teaching. And he labeled that a matter of theology, and it is, but it's also a matter of philosophy, because it was the philosophers who articulated God's timelessness. You're not going to find a verse in the Bible that says God is outside of time. That's something that the philosophers, and that was something articulated first from a philosophical point of view by philosophical theologians, and then became part of church teaching. So if you're going to smoke, I am too.
Good, let's do it.
I used to be a detective. People may know that, and this is back in the 90s. And so I've busted people. I've wrestled people to the ground to arrest them. And one of the things, at least it was true in the 90s, is all detectives smoke, because after you bust somebody, I mean, you never know, are they going to have a gun on them or what? It is a high adrenaline experience, and the detectives need to do something to relax afterwards.
Yeah. And now the closest you get to tackling people down to bust them is debates, which is also exhilarating.
Indeed.
Not the same thing, but... Hey, let's offer an objection to smoking. Smoking's bad for you, therefore it's a sin.
No. Smoking is not bad for you in and of itself. As the Catechism of the Catholic Church acknowledges, excess of alcohol, food, or smoking is sinful, but moderation would not be. So it's as Paracelsus said, the poison is the dose. Too much of anything, even water or oxygen, is fatal. But some oxygen or water is helpful.
But isn't it true that some tobacco isn't healthy in the way that oxygen and water are? For purposes of making the comparison, I picked two things that are essential to human life, namely water and oxygen. But that doesn't mean those are the only two things that can be useful for human life. Is your pipe collection infinite?
No, it is definitely finite.
Would it be possible to have an infinite collection of pipes?
Only if God wanted to give me one.
Here's something I was reading Aquinas' On the Eternity of the World, and for those watching, I recorded an audio book and published that on Patreon for my patrons. But it sounded like he was saying something like this: God can begin to act, I'm trying to find the right language, whenever he exists. So it's not as if God has to, not that he begins to exist, but it's not as if God exists, has to think for a while about the kind of world he wants, and then create it. So It sounded like Aquinas was saying that God can create from all eternity, and therefore it's not contrary to God's omnipotence to do that. And he uses an example from Augustine, who says if there was a foot planted in the ground from all eternity, there would be a footprint along with it from all eternity. It would be dependent upon the foot in a sort of ontological manner, but not in a chronological one. And in a similar way, the universe is dependent on God.
Yeah, and this kind of goes to a question that sometimes has been posed, sometimes tongue-in-cheek. What was God doing before he made the universe? And of course, the answer is that's a nonsensical question. It's like, what's south of the South Pole? Because time didn't exist before God made the universe. And so there was no time before the beginning of the universe for God to be doing something in. God is, and fundamentally, God's outside of time. So everything he does, at least from a Catholic perspective, it is. So everything he does is simultaneous from his perspective.
Yeah. See, the problem with pipes, Jimmy, at least in my experience, is that as soon as you take them out of your mouth, they very quickly go out. A cigar you can put down, leave for 5 minutes. I find pipes to be a much better, solo contemplative activity. But I feel bad for you. Every time I make you talk, you're gonna have to relight that pipe.
Don't worry about it.
All right, man alive. Let me suggest an argument that I've heard, and you show us why it's wrong, in a way that maybe even I can understand, right? And you of course, you touched upon this in the debate, but if the universe never had a beginning, then it is infinitely old, which means there has been an infinite number of moments that have preceded that moment.
Yep.
But if that's the case, that moment should never have occurred, but it did occur. Therefore, the past mustn't be infinite. I mean, that feels compelling.
Why shouldn't that moment have occurred?
Because you can't go past infinity. You can't count down from infinity, if you want to put it that way. And so if I think of the past being eternal, and you have an infinite number of moments elapsing, then wouldn't that moment be an infinite plus one, I suppose, is what people think of.
Okay, so it seems to me there's two thoughts there that are actually different. One is you can't count down from infinity. And that's true in the sense of there is no number on the line of natural numbers that is minus infinity or positive infinity, for that matter. Those are not natural numbers. And so you can't, and they have no predecessor, so you can't count down from them. Infinity is not a number in that way, but you can have always been counting. So if you have someone, and to represent the past, we'll use the negative numbers. So if yesterday someone was saying -1, and the day before that they were saying -2, and the day before that they were saying -3, and so on, all the way back into the past, then they would be saying a different number on every day endlessly. So the whole set of what they're saying is infinite, but there's no starting point to that. And each number they're saying on a given day will be finite, but the collection of numbers is infinite. The same way if they're counting forwards and they say 1 today, 2 tomorrow, 3 the day after, and so on, on any future day you name, they're going to be saying a finite number, and they're never going to say today is infinity day, because that's not on the number line. But the collection of numbers they will say in an endless future is infinite.
Okay.
So that's the first one. The other one was infinity plus one, this is going to get us into some trickier mathematical waters than we may want to get into, but to give a simplified version, if you envision the past as involving the negative numbers, which are infinite, and now the snap moment, I hope that's not a Thanos snap, but the snap moment is 0, and then future moments are the positive numbers. Well, you can proceed in that way. You can add to infinity in that sense. You're moving from -1 to 0 to 1 and so on, because the number line doesn't have to end at 0. It can be infinite in both directions.
Yes, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I don't have a lot of time here, and you might not either. So I want to kind of give you maybe some more room to sort of give your response. I mean, it just happened, the debate, so sometimes these things take time to think on. But
I think it went well. I think that, I can process it on different levels. Strictly a debate level, for example, or a substance level. I was pleased with it from both perspectives. I think that to process it on a debate level, I think that Dr. Craig did not so much rebut anything I said as just disagree with it. And I presented him with material that I think he's not used to encountering. I think he takes a different approach in how he formulates arguments apologetically for his audience. I think it's very important to begin with everything I know and formulate my arguments on that basis. And if I suspend something I know, like, oh, imagine that this didn't happen, even though I know it did, it's only for hypothetical purposes I'll do that. I think that's part of our duty as apologists is to not just argue, and no offense to lawyers, but not to argue like a lawyer where you'll say anything that'll be convincing regardless of your personal convictions. I think it's important as apologists to frame our arguments within our personal convictions, even if we sometimes will, as a hypothetical, depart from our personal convictions as a way of helping someone see a point. So I think it was successful on that level. Also, towards the end, he actually acknowledged I had a point on something and indicated he might have to modify his presentation. This came up on the can you form, that's his term, it's what he uses in his books. Can you form an actual infinite collection by successive addition? And I pointed out that either you're imagining forming from nothing, in which case it commits a fallacy, or if it doesn't mean that, it means forming it from some previous collection, in which case the previous collection just needs to be actually infinite. And sure, I can form it or complete it by adding one more member to it. So I have a new collection formed from a previous one. And he acknowledged there that he might have to reformulate the way he presents that. He suggested, for example, perhaps using the term enumerate. And if he were to do that, I would be curious to see how he expresses it. I would then have the same question. By enumerate, do you mean enumerate from a beginning, or do you mean enumerate given a previous set of numbers that we're not considering in this enumeration? And my suspicion is that the problem would return, just under new terminology.
A theory of time and B theory of time. Can you quickly explain what those are?
Sure. So the A theory of time is a view that, first I need to talk about two kinds of propositions. Some propositions have truth values that change from moment to moment. Like if I were to say, it is now 2:36 Pacific time, that would be true from my perspective. That would be true. It is 2:36 from Pacific time, according to my computer. But a minute from now, if I were to say it's 2:36 Pacific time, that would be false, because in reality it would be 2:37. So this claim about what time it it changes its truth value. And it's therefore called a tensed statement or a tensed proposition. Other ways of saying the same thing, like at this point in time, let's say I'm from God's perspective, and I'm looking at all of time, and I say, at time t, it is 2:36 Pacific time. But at time t plus 1, it is 2:37. Since he's looking at time objectively from the outside, both of those statements are true, and they will never change their truth values. And so those are called tenseless propositions. Okay. The somewhat confusingly named A theory of time is that in order to accurately describe time, you have to use tensed statements. And so this is also, the A theory is also sometimes called the tensed theory of time. By contrast, the B theory says, no, you don't have to use tense statements to accurately describe the world. You can use tenseless ones. And so the B theory is also called the tenseless theory. Now, even though they're not the same thing, the A theory and the B theory tend to match up with two of the views that Dr. Craig and I were discussing, presentism and eternalism.
Hmm.
Presentism is that from the ultimate perspective, which would be God's from a Christian point of view, only the present exists. And God would say the past and the future don't exist for him or for anybody else since he's got the ultimate perspective. And that's the position that Dr. Craig advocates.
Okay.
Eternalism, by contrast, says no, from God's perspective, outside
I
of
see.
time, all of time, past, present, and future, is real. And
So,
that tends to be associated with the B theory.
so if you held to Craig's theory of time, would you then agree with the Kalam cosmological argument from the philosophical standpoint? Like, is that the main crux of the issue here?
No, it's not, because in the posts that I put up at jimmyakin.com/kalam, I expressly put on my presentism hat for hypothetical purposes and say, okay, does this work from a presentist view either? And I concluded that it doesn't. For example, the let's take the first argument about an actual infinity cannot exist. Okay, suppose that's the case, and suppose presentism is true. Well, if presentism is true, how many past moments are there? None. So it's not an
Oh,
actual infinity.
but what if you were to say how many past presents were there?
Well, in that case, we've got a problem. If it doesn't matter ontologically how many what's the best way to put this? If they don't exist, they're just not an actual infinity. And if you're talking about, well, these things used to exist, but they don't now, and yeah, there were an infinite number of them, then there are two issues with that. The first one is you're no longer talking about objectively real things from a presentist perspective. You're talking about hypothetical things, conceptual things like numbers or truths, but not physical things that exist here in the real world. And Dr. Craig would say, okay, those I'm not worried about because those are either abstract objects that don't exist in the real world, or they're just conceptual objects that don't exist independently of the mind, or something like that. But then there's another problem coming from the Christian perspective is, well, we still have that promise of eternal life from God. So the number of days ahead of us is infinite.
Hmm.
And if we can allow the number of days that will be to be infinite, then we can allow the number of days that have been to be infinite on a presentist view. And Craig has arguments that he
Yeah, but
he
sorry,
tries to
sorry.
use against that, but they get more into the weeds.
Yeah, so sorry to cut you off here, but maybe a
Mhm.
clarifying question. I'm not
Yeah.
going to be in heaven for an infinite amount of time because it's going to begin. So I'm not allowing for an infinite number of time
No,
ahead of me.
you
Is that
you will be in, if you go to heaven, and what that really means is end up with God on the new united heaven and earth. We're not going to be ghosts for all eternity, just for a little while. But if you go to heaven, then you will exist for an infinite number of days. You will exist for an actually infinite amount of time. Now, any particular day in that future you name will only be a finite distance from the present. But the total collection of days that you will live has infinite size because there will never be a last day.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, maybe I'm still thinking of infinity as a number, like I'll never reach
Mhm.
that number. Is that what I'm doing?
It could well be.
Yeah. Golly. Well, this is terrific. Thanks for coming on. I mean, yeah, Craig's such a, you know, uh,
He's a nice
f-
guy.
great guy, formidable opponent. I mean, what was it like preparing for this?
Oh, it was, I do due diligence, whenever I do a debate.
Good idea.
And so I was reading in Craig's books. I was watching videos of him on YouTube. I was watching videos of people critiquing him. I was putting my own thoughts down. I took lots of notes, and then I did a series of blog posts to document those, both so that I would force myself to articulate my thoughts in advance, so that I wouldn't be fumbling around for how am I going to say this on the in on the day. And also, it gave me a chance to think, how am I going to say this as simply as possible?
Mm.
And I think on that front, I wish I had been able in the debate to avoid a little more of the technical jargon, but I was happy that we avoided as much of it as we did, because it's easy philosophically to use tons of baffle gab and
Mm.
just lose the audience while you're trying to sound smart. And what I try to do is make it as simple as I can. Sometimes reflexively a technical term will come out, but I really try to keep it simple. And so forcing myself to articulate it ahead of time also helped me keep it simple. And then it also provides a resource for people for more information on all this.
All right, excellent. And just closing here to those watching, I put a link in the top of the description, and I'll do it to this one as well. jimmyakin.com/KALAM if you want to do a deep dive into some of Jimmy's articles on this issue. I also want to let people know that next week I'll be interviewing Trent Horn live in studio. I'll be interviewing Dave Rubin on Monday, so hopefully y'all can subscribe and be here for that. Jimmy, thanks so much. Any closing thoughts or?
No, I just want to thank you. And if he ever sees this, I want to thank Dr. Craig for the discussion. I think it was enlightening, and I think it was valuable in that we covered we differed on things, but we covered this issue from an angle that I haven't seen it covered this way before. And so it wasn't just a retread of what he's done and others have done, over and over again in discussions of this. I think we got into some new material and forced each other to think, and I think that's valuable in and of itself.
Okay, yeah, I agree. Sorry to all those who are watching who are expecting some questions. I think I may have said we were going to do that, but my wife just texted me and she's like, "Hey, when are you coming home?" So now's a really good time to end this.
Yeah, for the sake of domestic peace, gotta heed that.
Indeed. All right. God bless, Jimmy. Thank you.
You too.